throw a lot of terms around these days. Narcissist, sociopath, psychopath. What do all these terms actually mean? Are these different types of personality disorders? Well, in today's episodes, we're going to be talking about what each is, as well as how it relates to narcissistic abuse. Thank you so much for joining me today on Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse. I'm your host, Dr. Carrie Kerr-McAvoy, a clinical mental health specialist with over 20 years of counseling experience and a narcissistic abuse survivor. In this podcast, we're going to actually take a closer look at these two personality types and what makes them tick. We'll also explore why trauma bonds are so challenging to break. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss future episodes, and leave me a review. I'd love to hear what you think of the show. As a listener-supported show, I appreciate all contributions so that you and I together can shed light on abuse. So with that said, let's listen in to this replay of a TikTok Live. Narcissists are not the only groups that cause narcissistic abuse. There are other personality styles that have been shown to cause problems for their partners and families and neighbors and coworkers. And this is the antisocial personality disorder. So today, I would like to dig into that to take a closer look at what is an antisocial personality disorder. What do we mean when we use the word psychopath and sociopath? Are they the same thing? Are they different? How do you know that you've met a psychopath versus a narcissist? What is all of this? Because we tend to get confused about them. And in fact, there's often thoughts that they're one and the same, and they're not. They're different types of groups. So let's stop for a moment and define this. Narcissistic abuse is perpetrated by a deception that substitutes the victim's reality for the perpetrator's reality. And the perpetrator does this for manipulation and exploitation. They have an ulterior motive that they want to keep the victim in the dark. A fantastic definition of narcissistic abuse was written in Psych Central by Dr. Kristen Milstead. She outlines 4 different points. And I don't want to review it because I have covered it before, but if you want to remind yourself what is the definition of narcissistic abuse, I think it is the best working definition that I have personally found. And again, you can find it in Psych Central. If you put in what is narcissistic abuse, Psych Central, and Dr. Milstead, you'll come up with a definition. But we often associate narcissistic abuse with narcissist, and it makes sense because the titles are the same. Narcissistic abuse, you end up thinking then just narcissist, create the abuse of narcissistic abuse. That actually isn't true. Narcissistic abuse is just an umbrella, and it's any form of deception, manipulation for this sense of exploitation of the victim. It doesn't just necessarily is excluded to narcissists. There are other categories, and the other big group is the antisocial personality disorder. So what is that? When we say that, what is that? Because a lot of times they're a blend of both. You have people who have narcissistic tendencies or traits, and you also have people who have antisocial or psychopathic tendencies and traits. So let's pause for a moment and separate them in 2 categories, because there is a big group of overlap, and I want to make sure we separate them. Oh, and I just saw someone finished my book, Love You More. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'd love to hear what you think about it. And I was in a relationship with a narcissistic sociopath, somebody who fits in the center. Interestingly enough, my childhood, I was raised around several psychopaths. So I actually have personal, I wish I didn't, experience with psychopaths. They're a scary group. They're a very freaky group. So what are they? Psychopaths are people who they've been described by psychodynamic theorists as having an empty core, that their self essentially is rather barren. It's devoid of a lot of what makes up you and me. Whereas a narcissist's core is fragile, it's very brittle, it's easily wounded and very weak. But a sociopath's core tends to be rather empty, barren, just devoid. And part of this is neurologically based. They actually are considered neurodivergent people because their neuroimaging looks different than the neuroimaging of the average population. One of the things they have a hard time with is they have a hard time identifying facial expressions of people. They've done tests where they have images up of people's faces, and you're supposed to tell, are they in a good mood or in a positive or bad mood? And they're very subtle. Some of them are micro expressions, and then there are others that are more obvious. Interestingly, those who score high in psychopathy tend to have a hard time identifying the facial expressions and knowing the difference between a bad facial expression and a positive facial expression. It takes a facial expression, a large reaction on the face for them to be able to see the differences, which is really interesting. If you think about being blind, relatively blind to identifying the emotional states of others, then it would make sense why then you're not particularly concerned about the emotional states of others, because you literally can't see it. Then it ceases to be something that you're interacting with or that something that is meaningful to you. That I find that very intriguing. But the areas of the brain that have to do with fight or flight, alarm, our sense of risk and fear is underactive. It's actually a very quiet part of their brain, where for you and I, if we're faced something very scary, we feel a lot of fear. That part really lights up. It's very active. So they don't get alarmed. They're not upset easily by the same things that upset us. Let me kind of review all the criteria of them. I know that I'm not going to be able to tell you with the DSM-5. I won't be able to kind of say, okay, look for these things. They need to have so many of the. I'm not going to be able to do that, but I can at least review majority of the characteristics according to DSM-5. There is a callous ruthlessness towards others, a lack of empathy. They have a sense that they're superior to other people. This is different than entitled. Narcissists want to be superior to other people. They do believe they're unique and should deserve special treatment, but narcissists, though, aren't for sure. There's an edginess or kind of an insecurity, whereas somebody with more psychopathic tendencies doesn't feel an insecurity about that. They just know they're superior. The rules do not apply to them. aren't concerned about that. They would be defined as conscienceless, so the things that would concern you and I about social mores and being appropriate are things that they aren't concerned with at all. That the fact that they are outside those lines don't disturb them and don't bother them. They're very exploitive. They have no problem being ruthless around the rules. They break the law frequently, maybe subtly, maybe not enough to get caught, but they have no qualms to doing what they need to do to get ahead. And they also are equally ruthless around the truth. They have no qualms to telling you whatever they think you need to hear in order to advance with their cause. Now, how does this differ? Because that means they're promiscuous, they're law-breaking, they're lying, they're deceiving, they're betraying, they're doing a lot of the similar things to narcissists. So how do then they differ from narcissists? Well, narcissist core is shame-based. There's this increased activity or energy around avoidance of shame. It's not that they may present somewhat similarly, but there's not the same kind of callousness, overt, ruthless, blunt, like, I don't care, nothing matters to me, it literally doesn't affect me. It's more brittle, it's more fragile than that. And I know that makes it hard to tell the difference because we're talking about very subtle things, almost abstract differences that make it really, really hard to differentiate the difference between the two of them. I would say this: if you're in a relationship with somebody where you know they have moments of remorse, maybe briefly, and then it disappears, it's fleeting. They have moments of emotional expression where they seem authentically connected with themselves, but although fleeting, that they do have kind of this insecurity around themselves. You're probably seeing more of a narcissistic tendency than you're actually seeing a psychopathic tendency. Psychopaths don't ask themselves those things. They aren't concerned about those things. They really don't care what you think of them. There's absolutely devoid concern about their impact on others. It is only this methodical, kind of almost cold relationship they have with the world because they're not able to have intimate connections with other people. I would say that's the big, big difference. Whereas narcissists tend to be very concerned about admiration and need it, a psychopath wouldn't. They wouldn't care if you admire them. That's beside the point. Why would they get caught up in the minutia of that? So that would be kind of the big ways of separating them. A really good author, if you want to read more about this, somebody who's devoted his life studying this, is Robert Hare, Dr. Robert Hare. He wrote the book Without Conscience. He also has another book called Snakes in Suits. I love that title. I think that's a great title. So I don't know if he's still living anymore, because these books are kind of the turn of the century, 20th, first centuries when he was writing these. But I think that those are very pivotal books, and they do a nice job kind of defining all of this. Are you at risk of being targeted by a dangerous man? What type of women do narcissist and psychopath males seek out? And what can all of us do to protect ourselves so that we're less at risk of being abused by these toxic people? If these questions intrigue you and you'd love to know the answers, then please join me for an upcoming interview on November 10th. I'm going to be meeting with researcher, author Sandra L. Brown. She has spent her lifetime working and researching dangerous types of men. Let's find out how we can reduce our exposure and what we can do to begin to protect ourselves better by identifying the risk factors. Get your tickets through the link in the show notes, and no worry if you can't make it the night of the event, because all ticket holders will receive a complimentary replay after the event concludes. This is a webinar you don't want to miss. I moved states away because of my abuser. This is what Virgo has to say. I have a feeling is that it's not going well, and you haven't gotten away from this person, is my suspicion. I'm glad you moved away, and we often have to do that because they continue to stalk us. And I know that's a very bothersome, like, why? Why do people stalk us? You'd think that once the relationship's over, it would be out of sight, out of mind, but it's not. Now, if you were in a relationship with a psychopath, sociopath, you probably would be out of sight, out of mind, except if they had a grudge with you and they really felt that that you severely hurt them in some way and they needed to even the score. They keep long records of what you've done and not done, and they would then make sure that they swing back to hold you accountable for that. Otherwise, for a psychopath, sociopath, you probably, once the relationship's over, because they're consumers only, they don't have relationships, they don't really care how you do, they never cared about you in the beginning, they would move on, move away, unless, for example, that they continue to have fun hurting you. It might be for their pleasure they would continue to stalk you. But narcissists are different. Narcissists, they continue to have relationships with us even after the relationship's over, because in their minds, they continue to own you. You're part of their collection. That's the best way that I can see it, is that you're part of their collection, and they periodically want to visit that collection, kind of reminisce about it, maybe see if they can even take you for another spin, see what they can do. It's very odd how they do that. So it's very, very hard to get away from a narcissist, because mentally you never get away from them. They're always a part of the mental landscape. I was with a narcissist for 13 years, and it's tough, but 6 years ago broke free. That is awesome. I'm so glad for that. Does a narcissist guy get diagnosed? How does it get diagnosed if they're so good at acting fine, especially tricking counselors? Yeah, that's an interesting question. Therapists, now I'm not speaking for every therapist. I really am not. I'm talking about therapists who've been trained heavily in personality disorders, and so they understand the nuanced way and how to use themselves in the room with different personality disorders, how personality disorders make them feel. They're really trained at a high level of sophistication. It's pretty clear. How you know is the response around comments and questions, whether or not there's a need for admiration and a mirroring going on. You can feel, it's hard to describe, but if you spend enough time with someone and you keep hearing the way that they frame things, you begin to get the sense of their worldview, and that worldview then tells you how they see themselves in the world, how they see other people around them, and how they're using you. For example, they will act entitled around the appointments or around the payments. They'll do funny things with payments. They may withhold it, forget to pay you. They may fuss around the cost and make jabs at you about how much it costs to see you. You'll get all of this, and all of that information tells you a lot about a person. So if you're paying attention to that, you can begin to get a sense this is a more narcissistic process. But I hate to tell you, not everybody who sees clients are reading that or are able to do that. So it's really important for you to interview people before you see them as a therapist, that you have a sense of how much experience do they have, and are they aware of even what narcissistic abuse is? Do they know what that is? And have they had much experience? Have they had extra training? One of the things I continue to do is take a lot of continuing education with what I consider people to be the experts in this. I've just finished 30 plus hours of training specifically on narcissistic abuse this year. So yeah, you'd want to watch for somebody who's having that clinical experience, but it's tough. Not everybody, I would say, is equally good at these things. How do you break a trauma bond? Somebody asked, how do you break the attachment that you have to a person who's pathologically narcissistic or sociopathic? And what is really even a trauma bond? It was fascinating. I don't know how many of you are aware that I had interviewed Dr. Kristen Milstead, Why Can't I Just Leave? That's the book she wrote, A Guide to Waking Up and Walking Out of Pathological Love Relationships. It's a fascinating book. If you guys haven't purchased it, I highly recommend. I think it is the best book out there that does this very nice synthesis of explanation of how the grooming happens, to the duality that you start to experience, which causes cognitive dissonance. Who do you really are in a relationship with? Is it who you thought you met, or is it somebody else? And then the effect of living under this very threatening, unsafe environment and how it creates the trauma bond. It is the best book that I know that synthesizes all of that. And I did a live webinar with her on August 18th, and the replays are now available for purchase. So if you think that would be beneficial, it was a fantastic interview. She gave the 5 stages of love bombing. She talked a lot. She's a researcher, so she came at it from the angle of a sociologist, researcher who also is narcissistically abused and understands the things that you and I need to get closure. She really approached the book from that angle and approached the webinar. So if you're interested, please check the link. So what is a trauma bond? And this is something she made a point of. A trauma bond is something that happens when you go through an extraordinarily unique situation that is highly scary and intense, confusing. It's a relationship that you build with the people who go through it with you. So if you survived a catastrophic childhood, you probably have a trauma bond with your siblings if they went through it with you. If you've been in the military and you went through, say you saw action with a squad, you probably have a trauma bond with those brothers and sisters that you served with. They've become very significant to you. If, God forbid, if you were in a hostage situation and you were with other people for a long period of time trying to survive this hostage situation, you would have a trauma bond with all those people in the room that you got to know. But interestingly enough, you also develop trauma bonds with abusers, especially when you live with them for periods of time and they increase your dependence on them. This happened, for example, for those of us who are old enough to remember, with Patty Hearst. She began to live with these people who then would scare her, threaten to kill her, and then turn around and give her seemingly kind things, like be concerned if she was cold at night, or gave her a glass of water, or took care of her needs. When they do this odd blend of withholding, punishment, fear, combined it with acts of kindness and sometimes seeing you, it ends up creating this connection that you have, that you become grateful for the kindness. You become highly dependent on them for your basic needs. Even though they're the ones that are depriving you of your rights, you become dependent on them. And yes, it's known also as Stockholm Syndrome. This is also referred to as brainwashing. It is also referred to as cult programming. So it's used in a variety of situations. The military does it. It wants you to have this very tight connection with your squad. It wants you to really trust those that are in charge of you and supervision over you. So it does this purposefully. It breaks you down and reconnects you with people, puts you through an extraordinarily difficult situation in order you have this bond, this connection. That's a trauma bond. Yeah, or a betrayal bond. That's Patrick Carnes talks about in his book called Betrayal Bonds. It is manipulative and for control, but for sometimes you think of the military, do I want the squad operating in one mind? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, because that then makes them more likely to protect our country better. I'm thankful that that technique is used that way. Now, when I hear people about, for example, I was old enough to know Jim Jones. For those of you, I don't know if you know about Jim Jones, he was a cult leader. In fact, actually, he had connections with people that I knew back in Michigan, and he had, I don't remember where it was someplace south. And he had a group of people where he felt like it's a threat, and he got them all to drink poison-laced Kool-Aid and killed themselves before people came in to discover it. Why would a whole group of people, reasonable people, business people, uproot their lives, move down to live on this compound, and then why would they knowingly drink a poison? Why would they do that? Or Waco in Texas is another great example with David Koresh. Why do people do that? Reasonable people do that. I was following the situation with, I know I'm going to say it wrong. It was on a HBO series, and it had the actress that played on Smallville, and I love her. I love that character. She got all wrapped up into it and ended up even getting other people to get into this Nexus or something like that, NX or something like that. She got people wrapped up to follow that, to do it. And now she's been charged, and I think she's been found to be guilty, charged with a criminal offense for participating in all of that. And so it is frightening how cult programming really, really works, and how it can get us to do reasonable things. Here's a question, because a lot of us get very negative on victims. If you read my book, it's interesting, my reviews levels are now fallen to 4.1 because I get periodically negative reviews. Why do I get negative reviews on a book that everybody, if you read the reviews, are 5 stars? It's one of the best books they ever read. Thank you. I'm not that grandiose to think that it's the best book ever written, but it is. I think it's a well-written book. It's a powerful story. So why do people have issues with my story? Well, it's because they don't understand what a trauma bond is, and they think I sound very pathetic. In fact, one person said in a review, she sure hopes I've waken up and know how to set boundaries better. So what happens to victims that make them so compelled, so stuck in the relationship that they end up not being able to save themselves? Name of my book's called Love You More, The Harrowing Tale of Lies, Sex Addiction, and Double Cross. So what people don't understand in my book is that I am paralyzed by a trauma bond. I am totally immobilized to the point that I can't protect myself or make moves. It is. And I really want the way out. The solution I want is for my ex to get better, for him to stop abusing me, and then it would solve all the problems. I keep hoping, because he's isolated me so severely that I'm not financially in trouble. He's wound me up financially. I have hardly any outside friends. I'm not even in the same country, that I don't know the language well, so I can't navigate the country. I have no home back in my home country, the United States. So I'm literally paralyzed in this place of dependency, to where my best solution is if he would just become healthier, more well-functioning, and stop hurting me, then all of this would go away. And that's what people don't understand, is that these trauma bonds cause you to do things that you normally wouldn't do. But you know what? We all do. We all do, because these forms of manipulation is used all around us. You're being constantly bombarded by these forms of manipulation. It's happening to you right now. You turn on a TV and you watch an ad, you just were attempted to be manipulated. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever done or bought something that you didn't mean or didn't really intend to do? Did you walk into a store or end up ordering something off of a show because you thought, hey, that looks really good, and you wonder later, why did you do that? Or isn't all that you thought it was? How many times have you gotten on Instagram and saw a fantastic product before you know it's in your cart and you're buying it? That is the effect of what we're talking about. But imagine that, the power of that, the effectiveness of ads, the effectiveness of the salesman, and put that into a context of now you're isolated. You've now maybe got married, maybe you have kids together, maybe you've bought something together, maybe you also you don't have a connection to the world around you. You do all of that, and no wonder people can't get out. No wonder it's extremely, extremely hard to get out. Now that you heard more about what makes up a psychopath or sociopath, what do you think? Have you met one in your life? I'd love to hear from you, and let me know. And be sure to get your ticket for the upcoming interview with Sandra Brown on November 10th, and check out her fascinating research-based book called Women Who Love Psychopaths. And until Thursday, I'll see you then. Bye-bye.